In today's session, we're going to look at the moral argument for God's existence. This is an argument which finds quite a number of sophisticated defenders on the contemporary philosophical scene. Although various versions of the moral argument are possible, the version I have adopted attempts to find an explanatory foundation or ground for the objective moral duties and values that we sense in moral experience. I backed into the moral argument accidentally. Speaking on college campuses, I would argue for the absurdity of life without God, that on an atheistic worldview, there are no ultimate objective moral values. Without God, everything becomes relative. And I found that students would typically respond to this argument by saying, but certain things really are right or wrong. Objective moral values do really exist. Now, obviously, what the students were saying didn't go any distance to refute my argument that if God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values. Rather, what they had done was to furnish the missing premise in an argument for God's existence. For now, we may argue as follows. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, but objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows logically, therefore God exists. This is a logically airtight argument for the existence of God based upon moral values and our moral experience. The first premise of the moral argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, is one that is affirmed by quite a number of atheist philosophers themselves. Indeed, in supporting this premise, I will typically quote people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, even Richard Dawkins, in order to show that on a naturalistic worldview, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Rather, human morality is just a byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. The second premise, that objective moral values and duties do exist, is based upon our moral experience. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us as objectively binding and true. Virtually everyone recognizes, for example, that it is morally wrong to walk into a grade school with an automatic weapon and to shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. I would encourage you simply to use examples of this sort in talking with people until you find an example that resonates with that other person. Especially effective are examples of religious intolerance or religious persecution. Ask someone if they really think that the Crusades was a morally neutral venture. If the Catholic churches attempt to mask priest abuse of children is something that is morally neutral, if religious hypocrisy is morally indifferent. And I think you'll find that if you're dealing with a sincere person, that they will very quickly come to recognize that, in fact, they do believe that at least some things are objectively right or wrong. And in that case, it will follow that God exists. One of the most important objections to basing morality in God is the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma asks, is something good because God wills it? Then it would seem that moral values are arbitrary, and God could have willed that hatred would be good, and we would have a moral duty to hate and try to hurt each other, which seems absurd. On the other hand, if you say that God wills something because it is good, then the good exists independently of God, and even God is subservient to it, so that moral values are not rooted in God. The Euthyphro dilemma is, however, a false dilemma, and we should not be fooled by it. The correct answer to the Euthyphro dilemma is that neither of the alternatives is true. The Euthyphro dilemma is, in fact, a false dilemma. There is a third alternative, and that is that God wills something because He is good. That is to say, God is himself the good, and his nature determines what are absolute moral values. God is essentially loving, kind, fair, impartial, and so forth. And moral values are determined by their approximation to God's moral character or nature, in the same way, for example, that music counts as a high-fidelity recording by how closely it approximates the sound of a live orchestra. God's moral nature expresses itself toward us in the form of moral commands, and these moral imperatives then constitute our moral duties, so that moral values and moral duties are to be found in the nature and the will of God. His commands are not arbitrary because they are necessary expressions of his own moral nature, which could not be possibly different. To wrap up this session, we'll be watching a fascinating debate that I had at the University of Notre Dame with the atheist thinker Sam Harris. Harris believes that there are objective moral values and duties, and he excoriates his fellow atheists for denying the objectivity of moral values and duties. But he tries to explain them or ground them independently of God. I want to invite you to listen carefully to this debate because I raise three objections to Harris's moral theory, which I believe are extremely powerful and which Harris does not answer. I think this provides one of the most telling demonstrations that a theistic-based morality stands head and shoulders above a naturalistic attempt to ground moral values and duties.